Okay, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to engage in this discussion. I'm very expectant in terms of what I will learn from others, but of course, not to be too much on the receiving end. I have some thoughts that I also share based on the invitation that was given to me. That's what I just summarized based on what was on the agenda. This is what I summarized my presentation to be about. I summarized it to be understanding climate migration at local and national levels, and this in the context of Uganda, with focus to come up with the messages around policy responses, and some extent, of course, some things to do with the institutions and planning. So I think for everyone is good morning. Just to be upfront, like I communicated when I was being asked to participate, I'll be having another meeting at 1:30 midday. So I'll be getting off at about 25 minutes past midday. And please, Isaiah, if I take longer than the time, I think it was 15 minutes. If I take longer than the time you've given to me, please stop me anytime you want. Sometimes teachers can get lost in two things and they forget time. So hopefully I'll be able to finish in time, but feel at liberty. The way the presentation I have is can stop at any time. So I wonder why my top is being covered here. So the subject matter, I think, which I see coming from this discussion is about environmental migration in general. That's what I see coming from all this. It's really about environmental migration. And when we talk about, just to remind ourselves, when we talk about environmental migrations or environmental migrants, we talk about persons who predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive changes in the environment that affect them adversely, or the living conditions affect them in a way that they find themselves obliged to leave their habitual homes or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently and move within their country or abroad. And this is according to IOM. But the key point I wanted to underscore on this point is that when we talk about migration, we know that it's very difficult to have migration explained by one factor or by one cause. All migrations will have a predominant cause, but there'll be many causes, some of them immediate, others long-term, that will be associated with a given kind of migration. So just to make that very clear from the very beginning and in terms of contextualizing. Now, when we talk about environmental migration, it's not something new. It's not a new subject. We remind ourselves that this is not a new subject. There has always been migration, population mobility associated with environmental changes. So, for example, in Uganda, when you look at this map, you'll see that, I don't know whether you can see my cursor, let me get this. When you get at this map, this is what is called the cattle corridor of Uganda. We have known for very, very many years that population in these areas continuously move in search for water mainly and forage, or what people usually call pasture. And the reason is that these areas are very prone to drought and water scarcity. And very worse, it gets worse when you go towards the northeast of the country. That's where it is a major problem. But the point here is that there is constant mobility. There has been constant mobility over years, driven by environmental conditions, some being seasonal, but others across years, annual changes in the environment. So the point here is that environment-related movements or mobility is something that has existed over very many years now. The difference now when we talk about the climate migration, we are talking about much severe and intense changes in the environment associated with climate and weather. Now, I also, to be very clear, within the context, just to be also when I was introducing myself, my background, I work largely around climate change and with focus on adaptation. And so most of my framing has a lot of connections with UNFCCC. And when we talk about climate change and migration, of course, there are many things that go beyond the context of UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But in the context of UNFCCC, there are three forms of climate-induced movement that are very clear. There's displacement, migration, and planned relocation. Okay, displacement usually associated with the sudden events like landslides, floods. Migration could be cross-cutting, but largely due to stressors and shocks that happen in the environment. Now, why am I saying this? Because there is a tendency to have a fusion between migration and climate refugees. Climate refugees within the domain of UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is not known for various reasons because of different the legal regimes around around refugees that in a way are not very clear. So it's not used because there are very many conflicts in terms of laws and policies that would introduce. So in the context of climate migration, you'll rarely find the word climate refugees. It is used by journalists, people who want to do advocacy and things like that. So just to be very clear that there is within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, refugees tends to be something that is not yet mainstreamed. And this tells us, of course, there's quite a lot to do in terms of legal and the policy framework, even at global level, whereby the issues of migration can be mainstreamed into practical terms. So when we talk about climate migration, it's just one of the forms of environment migrations. It's not new, but because of the uniqueness of climate change, human-induced climate change, it's gaining its more or less sort of domain and area of focus and space. So I thought those ones would be very clear to note. Now, a number of aspects, when we talk about climate migration, there is a context to that, which we may want to reflect on and discuss on. Some of them are facts and the general understood. The first thing is that Uganda is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And therefore, the likelihood of having climate migration is not surprising, and it's happened quite a lot because of the vulnerability of Uganda. And when we talk about vulnerability in Uganda, it's predominantly, the vulnerability in Uganda is predominant around socioeconomic vulnerabilities, which of course has a lot to do with the context in LDCs and some developing countries. Also very important is that Uganda is facing widespread environmental degradation, which compounds the climate and socioeconomic vulnerabilities. Now, for example, I always put this across. When you talk about the landslides in Ibududa, how much would you attribute those landslides to climate change? And how much would you attribute to environmental degradation? Of course, there's an interplay. There's an interplay in those, and unfortunately, we don't have sufficient data and information that can disaggregate these so that we can do some sorts of attribution. But one thing for sure is that there is a compounding effect of those to make these communities and places very susceptible to those problems. Now, migration is not only about sudden onset events like landslides, but we have also migrations associated with slow onset and sudden onset. We have those which are associated with the slow onset and others associated with sudden onset, environmental changes, and but of course affecting the the migrations in different ways. Gradual or slow processes, usually associated with land degradation and deterioration, have a lot to do with entrenching livelihood hardships And these are associated with what I would call adaptation and development deficits. And once these deficits are not addressed or are not dealt with, then these slow onset processes ultimately lead to migration. The difference with sudden onsets that, of course, have destruction of livelihoods and displacement of populations, in some cases temporarily or permanently. And this is very common when you talk about the area of Bududa, where you have temporary movements and people going back. And of course, that has all to do with the planning and policy frameworks that can be implemented to avoid such destructions of livelihoods when it is even obviously expected. The other fact that, or the other point I would want to make in terms of context, that migration, environment, and climate change nexus, that linkage, which is very important, is not well understood in Uganda, both in terms of evidence and, of course, in terms of practice, and also within the policy framework. And that leads me to the last point on context. Uganda lacks a comprehensive migration, legislative, and all policy framework that also integrates environment and climate change. Now, the migration policy, the last time I looked at it, mentions about gathering data and information around climate change, but that's where it stops. And that's only actually the area where it mentions climate change. There isn't provision and framing around how the policy guides the process of climate change and associated migration. So it's kind of an observation and an interest, but which is really stops at that. Now, we have, together with colleagues at Makerere University, we recently did work for IOM. IOM is the International Organization for Migration. And we came up with a report which was launched last year in March 2022, and the focus was on assessing the evidence, and this evidence is about migration, environment, and climate change nexus in Uganda. The report is all available online, and the purpose of this report is an effort by IOM to support the government of Uganda on very many things, growing capacity building, but the key focus areas and where the discussion is at the moment is to get such evidence to be a beginning point for enhancing the understanding of the government of Uganda and other stakeholders about migration and displacement in relation to environment and climate change challenges in Uganda. But then the other part is to enhance the capacity to formulate national and district level policies to better address environmental migration and displacement. And in as far as I understand, currently, there is moving from this report and the objectives of this whole activity to try to engage government at different levels to see how policy framing, planning, and institutional arrangements can start mainstreaming aspects to do with the climate migration. So now within the rest of my presentation, I'm going to hinge it on what we find in this report to provide a bit of content to provide the content to the context that I've been talking about. So I've moved from context, but now I want to go into the content of the contents with respect to some few examples and case studies that this report is based on. Now, this study, we did it mainly, not exclusively, mainly in 3 districts: Amudat, Bududa, and Katakwi. All of them are in eastern Uganda, but the fact that we were targeting mainly 3 hazards, climate hazards. We targeted drought in Karamoja, that is Amudat. Katakwi, we looked at floods. That's an area which is really very subjected to flooding. And then for landslides, for the part of landslides, that's when we looked at Bududa. So Amudat, just to begin with, as an example, it's an area dominated by pastoralism and agropastoralism, with the heavy exposure to drought, windstorms, and flash floods. But the major issue is drought. but due to the landscape and terrain, the flash floods can be an issue in this area. So again, talking about the context around vulnerability, there's high poverty. There are very high poverty levels. About 66% of the population live below the poverty line with the chronic food insecurity. And in many cases, these people have been depending on food aid. Quite a lot of very reactive responses to the problems that these people are facing. And very interesting, about 60% of the population have migrated in different ways, migrating in ways, some of which within the district, within the region, including movements to outside the region and district. So this is just a quick highlight of the migration routes and migration mapping. We did what is called participatory mobility mapping, and we just key highlights so that there are within Uganda migrations, people are moving outside Uganda to Kenya, but even within Uganda, moving to different districts. And these migrations include the back and forth, moving back and forth, but there are those definitely where we had instances of communities telling us that they have relatives who've moved to different parts of the country, but they never returned back. And the different signs in blue show the different causes why people could be migrating in a compounding way. No single factor or element of these entirely explains why they move, only to know that there are those which are predominant. There are windstorms, floods, drought, locust invasion, cattle rustling, land use conflict, water scarcity, movement from that is the one you see in this color. I don't know what to call it, yellowish, I think, and then is about moving outside of Amdat, but then blue, there are movements towards Amdat at different periods of time. Now, I want to bring to you to the drivers. What are the drivers to bring the message home? 2 points I want to make here. The first point is about the compounding effect of different factors leading to migration and movements, mobility. But then the other point is that another point I want to make is that it's very, very difficult to tease out because and which calls for evidence, of course. We need evidence because we still have what you can say movements with obvious explanations related to climate and weather-related effects, but teasing it out to attribute is still an issue. For Amdat, you can see that the highest peak as to why people say they migrate or what is causing migration, you can in a way in Amdat connect.
Would you just share the screen again because we cannot see the presentation?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I'll do that. Yeah, so I was saying that you can see that in Amdat, one of the districts in Uganda, you can see that the highest peaks for sure have something to say about climate change. You see poor quality pastures. Yes, you can have some explanations around the weather and climate-related aspects, water scarcity, and then harsh climatic conditions straightforward. So, but you can see that even within the poor quality pastures, you may not necessarily explain them based on climate and weather conditions, but definitely there is information to this. When you go to Katakwi, you can see the highest peak actually is around conflict over resources, which of course could be catalyzed by changing climate and weather conditions, but not necessarily because of climate conditions. But clearly the message is there that we can clearly see all these trends being influenced by changing weather and environmental conditions in the area, but with quite a lot of things that need to be teased out to kind of have much more of attributable climate change and influence on migration. So some policy observations as I wind up, some policy observations, current migration policy frameworks are fragmented. That's one thing that is observed. the current migration policy frameworks are fragmented and do not speak to each other. They do not mainstream climate change. So there are many migration policies or policies related to migration. There are many policies that you can link to migration in Uganda, but the language on migration across is fragmented, which would require some sort of harmonization with an intention to mainstream climate change. There is no clear mainstreaming of climate change, yet it's coming out as one of the issues that need to be addressed as a driver, as a factor, very important in as far as migration is concerned in Uganda. But then even from the institutional level, the coordination and cooperation is very weak in as far as migration is concerned with respect to environmental change and specifically for climate change. And even the plans with local governments, even with all the aspects they have to deal with and their low-level connection to the issues around the climate and migration or migration in general, their planning do not cover intentionally areas to do with out migration and in migration. So those are some of the quick observations that we make, even which are reflected in the report. And finally, just to highlight some response areas in terms of policy planning and institutional framework that call for action. One of them is to raise awareness. It's a very loud issue, but contextualizing, understanding it, how it is driving, climate change is driving migration together with other environmental changes is really has very low level of awareness. There's need for developing a much more comprehensive migration policy that covers the latest aspects with interest in climate and other environmental changes. And the other thing is that I think it's high time that migration is looked at as an adaptation strategy, so that every other migration that happens is linked to some forward-looking planning processes, so that it's not kind of a reactive way of responding to climate shocks and stresses. So in essence, by policy, adaptation can be used as an adaptation strategy where appropriate. Development plans, especially local governments, if this migration, climate change and migration are not integrated in their local development plans, I think bring the actions and reality solving problems and issues around climate and migration may not be very helpful. There's need to kind of look at it from the local level perspectives, which can be integrated into local government plans, development plans in ways that can be linked to financial considerations. The other is there could be considerations to prepare guidance for migration management that are climate change and environmental responsive, guidelines in a way that can help people to mainstream and they have climate and migration considerations in the activities for different sectors, different stakeholders in different levels. And a common platform or forum to enhance coordination of migration would be very, very important. And I think with the current discussions between the IOM and the government of Uganda, the hope is that some of these action areas could come out as entry points for ensuring that climate and migration or climate migration very much linked to other environmental migration issues can be mainstreamed into policy and practice, so that in essence, this is not a problem or an issue that is being looked from the sides. I think I'll stop there.